Kia ora mai tātou, nā mihi nui naku ki a koutou katoa, ina mana, ina reo, ina mata, ina whānau o Aotearoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Te pepeha ko maungu tautari te maunga, ko Arapuni te awa, ko Ngāti Tenemaka, Ngāti Kotaranga, Ngāti Rākawa te iwi, ko Welby toko ingoa. So just a kind of a brief introduction. That picture is, that's my dad and my mum. And my dad was called Arthur Ings. And so my name's not made up. Welby Ings isn't made up. They named me after a builder who was a friend of theirs called Welby, and Ings is a thing. And sitting on the swing there, I realized this morning, I looked at it, I went, this is so New Zealand, everyone's in bare feet. So, but that's the first half of the family. So they went on to have 3 other kids. So we came from quite a big family. And sitting on my mum's knee is my sister Suzanne, who became a teacher. And on the other swing is my twin sister and me. And so Katrina, she died a few years ago. And I don't know if any of you are twins or have raised twins. It's kind of like you end up driving around without a spare wheel in the back of your ute. And so I loved her very much, but we grew up vastly different as kids. So before we went to school, Katrina could read and write. She could arrange the Cuisinart blocks in order. She was charming and urbane, if you could be charming and urbane at Pukeatua. And she had a glorious run through school. I couldn't read or write until I was 15. So I was in the, I was identified as special, but not in a great way. So this was, I had special needs and learning disorders and a whole lot of other stuff. And that was essentially related to 2 things: that I didn't dance with the 2 great gods that have been nominated as the guardians of intelligence, and they are literacy and numeracy. And so I've kind of devoted my life to the nature of intelligence. So I think of it like this. So so I started teaching when I was 19, and up in Paparoa Primary. So this was 6 and 7-year-olds. And since then, I've taught at intermediates, secondary schools, polytechs, colleges of education. And for the last 20 years, I've worked with PhD students. So I supervise, I've got 14 PhD students who I love dearly most days. And I became really, really interested in what is this thing we call intelligence? What really is it? And one of the things that, so I'm working on a book at the moment. I'm not trying to sell a book. I'm just saying I'm working on a book because I've decided that maybe it'd be useful to actually start re-looking at what intelligence is. So we're considering it way above bollocks like IQ tests and dumbed down ideas that it's associated only with literacy and numeracy, and actually giving language to what we know exists. So one of the great beauties of my job is that I'm working with people who think very differently to me. The way they process the world is very different. And, you know, as an educator, like we're all sitting here on a Wednesday morning, and our job as educators, I think, is to understand how people think, and then to help that find itself in the most fertile soil possible, so that the unique beauty of thinking is treated as a gift. It's treated as a gift, and it's treated as a gift that needs to be grown. It comes to us as a seedling or a seed. So so that's what that's kind of 50 minutes is about. And you don't have to agree with me, okay? So one of the things I love about the idea of Symposium, if we go back to its origin, Symposium was something that you had after a meal and a bit of wine. And it was that kind of, it was ideas that were shared as a way of trying to catalyze thinking. And so that's the spirit that this is given. And I have to confess that I don't really like Zoom. I don't know how you guys have found it, but it's really hard not seeing the people you're talking to. But so you're just going to have to forgive if I'm not reading responses very well here. Okay, but let's go. One of the things I've thought about a lot is what does constitute intelligence in schools if we don't think more deeply? And so I want to be really clear here. There are many educators I have immense respect for. I get to work with some of the students that you've worked with who actually are not caught in this ritualized, myopic, narrow-minded idea of what intelligence is. But I thought it might be useful just to have a look at what the limited scope of this is to start off with. So there've been a lot of people who have been influential in understanding this, but you know, one of them is Howard Gardner, who kind of expanded the way we might understand intelligence, and he had a model which talked about 9 types. I have trouble with turning intelligence into binaries, going, there's this one and this one and this one, and which one are you, as if you're picking an astrology chart, you know, and I don't think it is. I think it's a beautifully fused and complex and mutable thing, intelligence. But in an effort to try and get us thinking more broadly, he kind of said this. So he kind of divided intelligence into zones, and he was nominating that, you know, there was intrapersonal and there was bodily kinesthetic. There was intelligence that was experienced in embodied ways. There was intelligence that was experienced mathematically, existentially. So all this realm. But what has actually taken root in education largely is this: that for all of even his spectrum, which I think is limited, but this is actually, if you ask, what is rewarded beyond the teacher saying you're actually intelligent, what is rewarded by marks and the way curriculum is structured looks more like this. We have nominated as the guardians of intelligence, or the devices for recognized intelligence, the linguistic and the mathematical. But even there, I think it's not as broad as that. It actually looks more like this. Let's just take linguistic for a moment. If you have a look in Aotearoa, what we actually mean here is English, the colonizer's language. That's what we mean by linguistic. So, I've taught in Otara and Taihape and Paparoa, lots of places, probably just like you. And I've taught kids who are bilingual or multilingual. So they can translate and pun and game between languages. So we understand that the ability to translate is a highly developed skill. But actually what gets recognized and marked is the ability to read, write, and speak English. We have, many diverse cultures with many diverse and complex linguistic profiles in our schools, but we still doggedly associate linguistics with one language, even though it's only 1/3 of the 3 languages that we see our official languages in our country. So that's the first one. And let's jump over to the other one, the logical mathematical. And maybe the easiest way to do this one is to look at you right now. So you came in here to be here at 10 past. Well, no, you're probably here when this symposium opened. This morning when you got up, you probably didn't calculate the solution to how do I get ready for this. You will have estimated, have I got time to have a shower? If I have that shower, that's going to take about that much time. I've got to get breakfast on. I've got to do this. I've got to do that. You will have taken a whole lot of variables, and you will have worked out how to be at place X in a focused way without calculating. What you will have orchestrated is the ability to estimate. Now, that's not something that we assess very, very much in schools, mainly because it's not easily accessible, and much of what we recognize as value is what can be assessed. So there's a tyrannical thing we get caught up in here, where we go, if it can be assessed, we can hold it as measurable, even if that's dubious sometimes, and what isn't, we'll say, awesome, you're doing really well, you're wonderful. But the kid goes, nah, you just gave me a mark for that. It says I'm not. Because, they see through stuff. And yet in our hearts, we know those kids we work with, and we know that there's extraordinary forms of intelligence. So, Deb referred to it. My other job is I direct film, and we've just got, I'm going to come to that in a wee while. But a couple of years ago, we were, I was shooting a film about, which part of it was set in the Western Desert in Egypt. We were shooting it in a quarry in Muruai. Okay, so I had to get, so we got a production designer out and said, look, can you give us a quote? We need a little building here built as a shelter. It's got to be open on two sides. It's got to be built into the rock. So we explained the thing, said, can you give us a quote? And here's what this extraordinary guy did. So this guy is a New Zealander, but he's in demand all over the world as a production designer. So I think production designer, think set designer, if you like, for film. And it had been raining. I tell you, never try and shoot the Western Desert in a quarry after a rainstorm. Not easy. But anyway, he said, oh, just a minute. And he didn't have a pen or bit of paper or anything with him. He walked around, walked out to the gate, came back, and he said, $5.5 grand, we can do it. And I said, can I ask, how did you know that? And I said, are you really good at maths? And he said, no, I'm terrible at maths. I was terrible at school. I'm terrible at maths. And I said, well, how did you get to $5.5 grand? Because I know this guy's quotes are legendary for being right on the mark. And he said, well, it's been raining, so we're not going to be able to pull the trucks right up to the site. So I'm going to have to park them at the gate. We're going to have to employ at least half a day's labor of somebody unskilled to carry the stuff. The timber is boxing, so because the structure doesn't have to last more than the few days to shoot, so we can save money there. He said, but the rocks, we're actually in a quarry, so we're going to have to drill down into the rock. So to do that's going to at least treble the time, and I'm going to have to hire machinery to do this. This guy had multiple variables coming in on this. And then he had the other one that's not easily accountable. He understood the value. He brought into that mix, what is the value of this thing? Because he knew that I'm anally retentive about production values. And I said, I want this absolutely believable. And he came up with this quote. And I was amazed. I was so impressed. And I said, you're a brilliant mathematician. And he said, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. And I said, you are a high functioning mathematical thinker. The interesting thing is, rather than calculation, you use estimation to think. And then I started thinking about that over the next few days. And I thought, how do we acknowledge and reward that? If I would argue it is the most common mathematical thinking tool we use, the most common. So even when we talk about the gods of literacy and numeracy, we are undercutting the spectrum of intelligence that might even operate in those areas. So let me jump on a little bit. So I love this. I don't actually care what someone's marks look like when they come to me and say they want to do a doctorate. I'm not that interested. I'm interested in the courage in their heart, their ability to fail and recover, and would this thesis do good in the world? Probably, I guess, roughly, those would be my three kind of guidelines on it. But what's happened is I've got to work with people who we would probably say were geniuses. I think that's not overstating it. Or if we take the original idea of genius, that genius, you're not a genius. Genius comes and visits you sometimes. There are off days. We all know when genius is not on the horizon. But these kids, these students, they hang out quite a bit of time with genius. So, but they often have very marginalized intelligences. And so I wanted to talk for a wee while just about some things that I've kind of identified in 20 years of working with these people, and how these people, these instances I'll get, would fail in a standard ritualized education system. So first, let's have a look at Paul. So Paul designs wheelchairs that climb upstairs. So he's a incredibly powerful thinker, but he's very reflective. In other words, he never, ever expect his answers to come popping out like something out of The Chaser. Never expect. I don't have TV. I have to confess. I've just seen The Chaser on my mum's TV, so I know it's a thing. Right? But he's not a mastermind guy. He's no good in the pub quiz. He's deeply reflective. So he takes time to get to somewhere. So he will pull away. And the reason he takes time is that he will turn something through a multiple variation of perspectives, looking at it again, a different way. This is what Kleining and Witt call a multiple variation perspective. Sorry, I'm pinching their term. So it's the next day or 2 days later, he comes up with something that's startling. And, you know, sometimes we work with people like that. It's like at a staff meeting and you go, the great idea will not come at the moment. It's someone who says, just give me a night to think about this. Deb's going to kill me for this, but this is something I recognized in her when we were working together in the Guardians group. The thing I really loved about her was the email that came the next day. So some people, they can give you an answer, but the depth of it will come after they've gone through a reflection. But you put Paul in an examination room with a clock ticking and 50 questions, and you will get no indication of his intelligence, or he'll either rush through to finish and give you a very low indication of his intelligence, or he won't finish. So reflective thinkers tend to do very badly in systems of education that institute things where knowledge has to be demonstrated within a fixed time frame, like examinations. So just to illustrate why that's so archaic, in the last 30 years in the discipline I work in, we have no exams at university for it. Everything is done by project, everything. The PhD candidates, there's no exam in a PhD. You create a body of work that we would call a thesis, and then it is sent out to scholars. They read it, they come back, and you'll be questioned for up to 2 hours on it. And then they'll make a determination. There's no A, B, C, D or anything. It's just, is it there or is it not? So the reflective thinker. Talita. I was always grateful for, and I don't know who this was, for a teacher in Talita's past who somehow enabled her to grasp onto hope and belief that there was something wonderful in her, even though she was riddled with doubt. As most of us, many of us are riddled with doubt. We might be high performing, but doubt at its best is the tool we use to sharpen our intellects on, our ability on, but it's also crippling. And so she didn't have enough grades to be able to get into university, but she managed to come in on a certificate. And her work was always uneven. If she had to write anything, it was, or if she was put in, if she had to do anything on the spot, like an examination, like, look, you've got a seminar where she had to field questions. It just all went to custard. It went to custard. She had the most beautiful, beautiful intellect. And she, in her PhD, was the first Tongan woman designer in the world to do a practice-led PhD. She developed a form of editing for documentaries based on the rhythmic speech of Tongan women. It was just an extraordinary body of work, but she was finely tuned. And anxiety or a sense of not being able to think under pressure, if that was how you were going to be measured by thinking under pressure, she would do badly. And yet if you took that off, this woman danced with the stars. I don't mean celebrities. I mean, her intellect was incredible. Or Carol. So this is interesting that the whole field of material thinking has become much more discussed since about 2009 out of Scandinavia. These are people who actually think with their hands. So they are, if Palisima, the theorist and architect, talks about the thinking hand, some people think physically. They are best in a physical realm. That's where you'll see the height of their intellect working. So sometimes it's the teacher who's really good when they're in the physical state of teaching and learning and reflecting. They can do this on the hoof. Take them out and ask them to abstract it in an essay. No. But watch them inside when they are embodied in something in a material way. and they're incredible. So sometimes you'll get architects who are material thinkers. They can work abstractly, but if they can build models or they can work with stuff, they can get to great depth. So I've seen the same things with raranga, with carving, with architecture, with filmmaking, with teaching. So these people they rely on being deeply inside the problem to think. Oh, look, I'm just stumbling to get a term for this, but this is something that I've only woken up to in the last few years. I worked with a guy a few years ago who probably, well, one of the most intelligent people I've ever worked with. And he managed to design software that could take sound and turn it into an object. So he could take the sound of you cooking breakfast and make a bracelet from it. He could take the conversation, the first words that your child said, and turn it into a ring. So he developed something for translating sound into form. But he couldn't write a thesis and he couldn't write an essay. It had nothing to do with it had to do with the type of intelligence. He was what I would call non-linear. In other words, he didn't think like this. He thought in a multiple matrix with a matrices. So he was something that was done here was affecting something here and here and here. And he was sorry, that was badly demonstrated, but most of our education system is reliant on people being able to make linear narratives of how they think. But not everybody does. And some extremely advanced extremely advanced intelligence doesn't think in a linear manner. And they get penalized. They find themselves, and this is the deep thing. I know you will have experienced the same thing. The tragedy when somebody who is genuinely gifted loses sight of their intelligence and comes to believe there's something wrong with them because the extraordinary way and sophisticated way that their brain processes is not accommodated within a ritualized approach to education. So, and now I want to come to one which I'm just kind of trying to work out now. I've done quite a bit, as Deborah noted, I do quite a bit of work with creativity because I don't think creativity is aesthetic decision making. I think it's much more complex than that. Nor do I think it's the binary, the opposite to rational thought. I think the chair you're sitting on right at the moment is a mixture of creative and rational thought. And creative thought is not picking the color for the upholstery. So I tried to kind of understand maybe what is it to think creatively. And so I'm stumbling at this a little bit, but this is where I am at the moment. I've seen demonstrated the ability to translate knowledge from one thing, interpret it, and place it in another realm. So let me take an example. 26th of April, 1937, Picasso was able to translate the nature of the bombing of Guernica, of war, the visceral nature of war, into a mural. So he could take the experience that lived in one form and translate over to another. A few years ago, I was up in Shanghai with some friends, and they took me to a concert. So I'm a junkie for that kind of stuff. And we were sitting there, and the pianist Liang was playing some music, and he played Chopin, he played this Western stuff, and then he played one of Tan Dun's compositions, and it was called Watercolor of My Village. I'm not a guy who cries easily. It was the sound of a watercolor. It was the sound of love and nostalgia and disconnection and loss. It was absolutely extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. He could compose sound as a watercolor that was also memory. Well, that's extraordinary intellectually. That's an extraordinary feat intellectually. And yet we will still dumb down the creative, what we call arts to schools, to something associated with figurative representation or art, skills of depiction. without actually unpacking what thought is. So let me just take this idea of translative interpretive thinking another step. When at that concert, when that piece of music was played, before that, he played Chopin's Nocturne. So what is that? So this is the ability of someone to translate the ethos, the spirit of night, into music, to translate between paradigms, if you want, knowledge from one realm completely to another. So night, applying that form of intelligence, can do this. So let's think about that for a moment. That's a beautiful, beautiful thing. I don't mean the music, I mean that kind of thought. That's an amazing kind of intelligence. And this is the student who can dance fire or dance being misunderstood. But it also occurs in other realms, not necessarily in the arts. So if I've just, in the lockdown, I couldn't get to a library, and I don't like reading on a device. I like books. So I went into my library and I picked out George Orwell's 1984. Okay, not the happiest read, but an interesting one, because I knew, he wrote that in 1949, but I remember reading his essay from 1946 that came out before that, which looked at politics and the English language. And he was arguing that language can be used in politics, can be used manipulatively to reduce critical thinking. So here was a guy who had a concept that he had explored in a piece of scholarly writing. But then he took that and applied that into a narrative, a fictional narrative that projected forward to a dystopian future. He gave it character, he gave it environment. He took the ideas and was able to translate them into another realm. So, and what he talked about, I still encounter today in things like genocidal language, concepts like ethnic cleansing. The fact that the place where refugees, this terrible human situation, are held while moving from one place to another is a transit center, the same name for the bus station downtown. There's simplification of complexity to things like words like Facebook, when in fact we know that there's a big difference between kanohi keti kanohi, the face-to-face. When we're in a room having a cup of tea, sitting with somebody, we know there's a massive difference between face-to-face and online communication. So, and he was arguing, of course, that this kind of speech, it works to lower the ability to think and articulate. But he made it accessible to people because he fictionalized it. He could translate it into something fictional. And so we can read that and then pull it through to today. So he was, so the discussion around this was going, this is knocking out stuff like irony and satire, those things that cause you to critique what you see. And it's something where language is used to simplify how we think, to heighten the level of non-criticality. So all of those are examples of where an intellect takes something from one realm and doesn't just translate it, they synthesize it, they break it down and reconstruct it in another way. So even if you take Bloom's taxonomy, I don't like Bloom's taxonomy, but even if you do, he rates synthesis way up there. I actually think that it's a very complex, synthesis is a very complex, but also a very ordinary skill. I'm not diminishing its heightened state by calling it ordinary. I just think we use it a lot. So I'm going to show you. I wrestled with this, but I thought, oh, damn it. So I've just been making a film, and the truth is, although I write books and journal articles and all that, writing is not the way I use to think most rigorously. I draw, and I draw because it allows me time to dwell with an idea, up to kind of 20 minutes. So there's a character in the film. Before I write a screenplay, I will draw it. And I don't mean storyboard. I'll just draw the world and draw things to try and understand character. So Fitu in the film, he's a fictional character, but he's made up of lots of little bits of people who I know. So I drew him, but then I had to translate who he was. So he came from no form into form through drawing. And then I had to work out where he lived. So I began drawing where he could live, trying to imagine where he could live, because I had to get a place where he lived that would be a dimension of his character, that would tell us about who he was. From there, we built that world and its interior. So I now have immense respect for Raranga. So it took me a lot. I had to learn how to make kete off YouTube, and it nearly killed me. But so I designed and made the dressing table, all the stuff in there that's been made. And making, because I tend to be quite material with my thinking, while I was making things physically, I could think about his character, so that when it came time to direct that character in the film, I knew him very deeply. And then with the actor, I said to him, I asked him to make kete, so he knew, not so that he could perform that well, but so he knew the embodied process of that. So some actors are very materially oriented. They bury themselves in the materiality of their world as a way of being able to understand it. And to very high, so some forms of acting are very heightened forms of translation. So let's just jump out of that for a moment. And I look at what happens in schooling, and I'm only talking at the worst, the less successful forms of approaches to intelligence, where we shovel people into rooms with a clock ticking, or we give them a test in the back of the class and we collate some marks numerically, and we say that somehow we've given an account of their thinking. So what I'm not talking about are those amazing things where teachers assess by being with and listening and watching and describing what they see and hear. That is much more sophisticated. So, but if I look at, if we look at Alan Turing, so you probably kind of know about this guy. He always kind of breaks my heart a wee bit, because I feel a bit of a leak. So I'm a gay man, and this guy was gay, and he committed suicide because if we're going to be blunt, when the English he helped crack the Enigma code, incredibly bright guy. And he, at the end of, when the war was over, they then decided to acknowledge that he was homosexual, and he was forced onto a treatment of hormones and suffered incredible depression. And he took his life, and he took his life by covering an apple with cyanide, and he ate it. So here's the father of the computer you're watching this on. He helped crack the Enigma code. Have a look at his school report. Okay, this is 1929. So here's a mathematical genius, and we've got, so English reading is weak. French prose is very weak. Essays grandiose beyond his abilities. Oh, I love that. I love people who are grandiose beyond their abilities. It means that they're taking risks, but actually it wasn't meant as a compliment here. Mathematics promised, but undermined by untidy work. What? Physics. He must remember that Cambridge will want sound knowledge rather than vague ideas. This is the report on Alan Turing. You know, and when we get reduced as educators to reporting something based on tidiness, clarity, doing what is prescribed within the boundaries of what is prescribed, reporting fails. It fails to talk with other people who love that child, the parents, the communities, them, about the complexity and beauty of their nature. And that's why I've always, you know, the first speaker, I love the thing she was talking about, you know, with the local community. You know, it's simply going, oh, let's have a report evening and everybody comes up. Well, my parents couldn't come up because they had 2 jobs. So they couldn't have come up to school. And lots of the kids I taught, you know, back in the day, the parents were working 2 jobs, they couldn't come. So you find ways of going out of the school into the community. And so we're able to describe that complexity of intellectual engagement we see with kids. When we talk about gifted, it's not about the marks on a test. It's about the nuanced and beautiful, distinctive way that that person can process knowledge that other people can't. So now we come to this, the ritualized system of measuring intelligence. And this has sat there for a long, long time, like decades and decades and decades. And it's still under questioned, even though, as I said, at the university, if I look at business studies, I look at design, I look at a lot of the newer disciplines, we don't examine like this. We don't do this because we know this does not give us an indication of the intelligence of the person. This gives us the ability to systemize a performance inside constraints. It's not a measure. It's a very, very flawed measure. And yet we still will rank people and rank schools and rank communities based on this awful, awful, archaic system. And sitting against that are these much deeper systems that individual teachers will use and some schools will elevate, where they minimalize this. If this is the way examination is understood, they minimalize that and elevate other systems. So when I look at, if you take a child, a New Zealand child, and they come to school, this is a list of their experience of being examined as they come through. This is minimum. And when we say NCA level 1, we're not talking one exam that year. We know we're talking multiple examinations. So people come through and we have often a counter narrative set up. This one going, you're not bright, you're not bright. And teacher going, I can recognize, and parents and community going, I can recognize this brightness. All the other way around, where it goes, you're really, really bright, you're really, really great. And actually they're not. What they are is articulate. Or what they are is they can work out a system. And so let me just repeat that. Being articulate is not the same as being intelligent. Being articulate is not the same as being intelligent. And some people are not articulate at all, but have the most extraordinary intellects. You know, that they may be limited with writing, or they may not be able to express themselves in words really well. But if you look at the object, the system, the whatever that they've developed, it's incredibly complex. They are articulate inside the system, but not articulate in the ways that we often look for being articulate. So one of the questions, I noticed some of the questions coming in, and I saw the word how at the front of a lot of them, and I reckon, yeah, that's true. So we can know all about this stuff, but you go, what do I do? What do I do? Well, first thing is you're probably doing some really good stuff now. And it's good to be able to recognize what that is. What are these things that are working against the dominant narrative of framing intelligence and then rewarding certain kinds of intelligence? But when I look at it and go, so what holds things back? I'd like to share some ideas with it. One of the difficulties we sometimes encounter in communities at the moment is that the parents of our kids came through a neoliberal New Zealand education system. Their grandparents didn't. So if we have a look at sort of in the late 30s, early 40s, New Zealand underwent this incredible revolution in education, and it was a world leader right up through to the 70s, where the child was actually the center of the education system. So this is Fraser and Beebe, but actually it's not just them. It's teachers in education, people in schools shaping up this environment where the understanding was, here's the child, and the teacher created the most fertile environment for that child to grow at their own rate, in their own way, to their most elevated form and high functioning form of intelligence. That was what child-centered meant. So prior to that, we'd had a teacher-centered thing, which we'd imported broadly from the UK, which was, here's the teacher, they're going to give you some stuff, and then you show that you've got that stuff. So it was teacher-centered. And then we moved to a system that elevated this idea of exemplars of what an average child would be doing at that age. And we measured people not against, we locked measuring into this idea of performing against pre-imagined descriptors. And that's what parents have come through. So anxiously, they love their kids. They want their kids. They want to know this thing, how is my child doing? And when you go, well, let me describe, they go, no, but are they behind? And you go, oh dear, that's not what intelligence is, being behind or ahead. It's not a race to be the first one to learn to walk as a baby. It's not the race to be able to subtract by the age of 5.5. It's not. Intelligence is far more complex and nuanced. And so the parents have been shaped by this idea of measuring, comparing, performing, and they grew up in a world where education was understood as a business, even at its most toxic, to the idea that parents were clients. So we're trying to work with change in a paradigm where we have a generation of people who were shaped and rewarded by something else. And many teachers in schools also were successful in this system. So their deep down rewards were based with their high performance in a comparative environment that measured. So the neoliberal environment, I think, is much more than a political debate. It's an ideological debate. And the fact that you're sitting here on a Wednesday morning and listening to this says that you probably question the value. You're trying to find and believe there is value that is tied more to the distinctive and complex nature of intelligence as something that in its true form is beyond being able to be measured in purely quantitative ways. We also face misunderstanding about intelligence. So people will often hold very deeply set ideas about their IQ, how they did in the exam. You say, are you good at maths? And they go, oh, I did really bad, I only got a merit, or whatever. So they get these ideas that are set down. So this, when we're talking about intelligence like this, it is often quite foreign to people, even though, here's the extraordinary things, they are the living embodiment of a diverse intelligence. But they are also shaped by what has been rewarded as conventionally framed intelligence. So the model they've lived through has tended to be the protege. So at the top of the question mark is the high achiever or the teacher or the whatever. And they were basically, the model they had was learn how to do this, and then you can get to here. But the developmental model looks like this. It says the person with the light is the learner. It's the person behind them that's the educator. They go, my job is to be at your shoulder as you go forward, because I cannot know your journey exactly. What I can do is be there to support you. So sometimes we see this in community groups, in kapahaka, in drama groups, in sports teams. This is the kind of concept of the coach, that leader, and many incredible teachers. If you push away from them the tyranny of having to assess things, giving the dominance to assessment by marking. And so I look where we are now. So I'm in Auckland. So You just be glad that your photos aren't on the computer at the moment, because we all need haircuts, seriously. And I go for a walk down the road, and it looks like someone's approaching the 1970s here. But I've been thinking about how with what we have experienced during the lockdowns, be able to be part of initiating those deeper discussions, or make the journeys that you're making at the moment. So most of you right now are trying to probably expand the way people think about intelligence. And good on you, you know. And we go, okay, so what if we're in an environment where we have neoliberally educated people? We have many colleagues who have been rewarded in that system and been promoted by that system. We have anxiety around not being able to cope in the world. And then we have COVID. So what's that? So let's just pretend COVID isn't entirely terrible. I'll tell you what, 5 weeks in Auckland, it's terrible. But anyway, so I asked, what is this new generation of kids seeing? Well, and their parents, while these kids have been locked down at home. So they've understood that time, demarcating time, is actually not how people learn. Life, when they're learning at home, learning is something that's fluid and integrated with learning. It's with life. So it's not divided by bells or timetables or portioned out like that. That it also occurs beyond disciplines. So disciplinarity is something that happened with the institutionalization of learning, and therefore how we came to see intelligence. It's not assessment driven. So your kids learning at home with you they're learning without the carrot of assessment being held there as a replacement model. What has to be there is the intrinsic value of the learning. That they're often material thinking, that they are thinking with what's available, and that there is a kind of social intimacy with it, that it's forced, I know, but we have a generation of kids who I would argue optimistically have seen better communities and a better nation trying to work together for a common good in a way that no other generation has seen. And we have to, I would argue that this is why it's an opportune time at the moment for change, because parents have the most deeply embodied experience of what learning is, because they've had their kids at home for such long periods of time, understanding that learning may not be assessment driven, it may not be divided by disciplines, it may not be divided by time, but it is marked by things like passion and curiosity and being able to organize yourself. So I'd just like to kind of finish with this. And so this is the how. You know, we're trying to do something to make a world better, to make a world where people don't get swayed by some rubbish that's been put online into doing things that are unsafe for them and their community, that they don't start thinking that what gets fed to them across the news at night is the picture of the world, that they don't think that what gets promoted to them as the must have and must be bought is actually the truth. So we, you know, as educators, we are asked by our nation to help to grow. When we talk about the intellectual richness, that's not about content acquisition as much as it is about ability to think. So here's some stuff that I've been thinking about. One of the things that if you've got a gifted learner is that they can experience isolation really easily. So let me show you a couple, because these don't get talked about that much, but the tyranny of being a role model. Oh God, it's hard being, well, I never was, let's be honest, I never was a role model. But, you know, I've seen kids weighted down by badges, head of the kapahaka, head of the sports team, head of this A+ whatever, and they live in this hugely anxious world with a facade they are never able to maintain. All you could do is lie to maintain it. And so we take gifted people and we put them often in terrible environments where they can confuse being loved with being successful. They're asked to adopt a responsibility for being perfect or flawless, given that we are all flawed and we live in a flawed environment. And so unless they can get support beyond that narrow world that keeps recycling those expectations, they're very vulnerable. And I know this because, you know, I've done a bit of work around mental health in universities, because it's a little bit like you're facing at the moment, I'm sure. You know, the issue, the anxiety thing and depression has gone through the roof. It has. That's not catastrophizing things. It has. And we try to find ways to work productively with people so that they are able to be connected with something other than the expectations that cause them to anxiously sense that they won't be good enough. So the ideological support is to connect people with the ordinariness of who they are. So when we say gifted, maybe that doesn't mean extraordinary. That just means a contribution you can make to a better ordinary. Sorry, that sounds a little bit wordy, but that maybe if we don't think of giftedness as something remote and separate, but as something deeply integrated and resourcing and able to draw on and be part of something that doesn't always work, we get a more secure environment for people to take risks. Because one of the common things that experience is that kids who would be quite courageous thinkers are so anxious about failing that they won't take risks. And so they see people blowtorched on social media for saying the wrong thing. Look, part of navigating in the world as a thinking person is that being wrong sometimes, you know, because we're in a state of learning. We don't attain learning and hold it. We're constantly in a state. So we've got to, you know, the things we do to wrap around gifted people to help them be at home in a world where failing is part of things is a good thing. And that means maintaining intellectual openness. So that means that, and this is linked a little bit to the tyranny of success too, that our pursuit of being right, and remember, most examining that we use in schools is based on the idea of right and wrong, but actually that's not how the intellectual environment is made up. It's made up, it's fluid, it's protein, it moves all the time. So that ability to be open to ideas and values that are not our own, if I go back to Aristotle, and I'm paraphrasing here terribly, you know, but his principle was that the mark of an educated mind is to be able to hold conflicting ideas and see the value in them. So not ideologically captured, not fundamentalist, not joining the march going, it should be this or this, but being a thinking person who appreciates variation is a much healthier place to be. That becomes the idea of critical thinking being so important. So these kids are growing up in a world that is, you know, it's sometimes described as the world's finest library, online and connectivity, the world's most accessible variety of intellectual ideas inside the most toxic rubbish heap of groomed, dangerous, false knowing. And so we have to grow critical discernment, which means opening up discursive modes where people talk about and think about values and the value of something, rather than going, which is right and which is wrong. And the reason you're sitting here right now is this one. And this is where I have so much respect for every one of us who goes into the world without the roadmap, is you refuse to relinquish agency. You believe there is something better. And you go, I may not have the roadmap completely, but I believe there is something better for these kids. I believe it. And you don't give up agency. And by doing that, that is actually how you role model strength. Unseen, you're actually the greater demonstrator of strength and values than any list that's put up on the wall of a classroom. And so I finish with this. This is a couple of Greek words, but they actually contribute to a word that we use a lot. And you hear people associating it a lot with advanced or very active and healthy thinking. And it means, it's the word enthusiasm, to throw yourself in with such passionate light that you will light up what you're doing and give it life. It comes from two Greek words, inner, and theos, God. Inner God. That inside you, inside every learner, there is an inner God. And when that is healthy, I think like moriora, or when it's in a state of enthusiasm, then that's where great learning happens. But sometimes we get kids and there's only smoke coming from the wick because they've lost sight of their intelligence. They've lost the spirit's low, and they will gravitate towards the warmth of other people who still hold belief. And that's probably you. So that even on our worst days, sometimes we can be the thing that's most necessary for that person to hold on to. Or it may be somebody in our community or in our family, but it's really, really important. And that theos is a thing that resources all of this underneath. So all I can say is this: on a Wednesday morning, if somehow I was able to put an arm around your shoulder, make you feel a little stronger, help you feel a little stronger, or even contest some of the ideas I've shared with you, that would be what a symposium's about, to create a fertile world for thought. So thank you for joining. And I hope that sharing those ideas has been of some use to you. Thank you.